Well, good morning. The Helsinki Commission will come to order. And let me thank particularly our witnesses. I know they traveled a long distance to be with us, and we thank them very much for appearing before the Helsinki Commission. I can't think of a more important fundamental role for the creation of the Helsinki process, for the U.S. Helsinki Commission, and for the OSCE today than the issue of trying to mitigate inter-ethnic conflicts in the OSCE region. I think that when the organization was originally created, this was primarily one of its primary functions. We had been through wars, we had been through ethnic episodes, and I think our hope was that by signing on to the fundamental principles within OSCE related to human rights, security, and economic issues, that we would ease the ethnic problems in the region. And in fact, I believe OSCE has been responsible for mitigating problems around the region and has been used as an example throughout the universe. So I think it has had its impact. But clearly we are still being challenged today. And that is why we want to have regular hearings to bring us up to date as to what is happening as far as inter-ethnic conflict within the OSCE region. And that's why I'm particularly pleased that our three witnesses could be with us today. They are truly experts in the area that we examine today. The witnesses' full bios are available outside the hearing room, but briefly, Ambassador Tiglavini led the European Union's investigation into the causes of the Russian-Georgia conflict in 2008 and prepared an excellent report which we have found to be extremely helpful. Ambassador Samanibi is presently the EU Special Representative on the South Caucasus and has served as OSCE head of mission in Croatia. Ambassador Jensen Peterson is a distinguished international diplomat with extensive experience in the Balkans. So we really do have with us today three individuals who can, I hope, help us understand the current status within the OSCE on this issue. I do want to note that we did invite the OSCE High Commissioner on National Minorities to participate in this hearing, and while that was not possible, I did have the opportunity to meet with the High Commissioner when he visited Washington in March. Among other issues, we discussed the recommendations on national minorities in interstate relations prepared under the auspices of the High Commissioner. These 19 guidelines provided greater clarity on how states can pursue their interests with regards to minorities without jeopardizing peace and good neighborly relations. They constitute yet another outstanding contribution of the High Commissioner's Office to the work of the OSCE and should serve as a foundation for the OSCE's efforts in this area. Ethnic conflicts continue to break out within the OSCE region at great cost to the affected countries and populations. In this connection, we are closely watching developments in Kyrgyzstan, where amidst the turmoil and ouster of the government in the last few weeks, land grabs and violent attacks were directed against Russians, Kazakhs, and other minorities. Ethnic conflicts combined with territorial disputes have erupted in the Caucasus as well, causing many thousands of casualties, with hundreds of thousands of civilians remain displaced and unable to return to their homes. As a result, security within the region is seriously undermined, while economic development is stymied by the insecurity and unsettled legal issues, particularly where the conflicts are interstate in character. The Crimea region of the Ukraine still bears the wounds of the 1944 mass deportation of thousands of Crimeans, Tatars, and other ethnic minorities in Ukraine by Joseph Stalin. The government of Ukraine and the affected population in Crimea continue to be challenged with finding mutually acceptable settlements on property rights, as well as the exercise of education and language rights of the Ukrainians, Russians, Tatars, and other minorities in the region. This July will commemorate the genocide which occurred at Srebrenica in Bosnia 15 years ago, the senseless slaughter of 8,000 Bosniak men and boys trapped by Serb militants in what the UN declared safe haven. This horrific event should be kept in mind as we proceed with today's hearing. Srebrenica demonstrates in our own time the degree in which even relatively small ethnic differences can generate fears and prejudice that in turn can lead to dangerously to hatred, violence, and aggression, quite literally against innocent neighbors. Perhaps the most important lesson of Srebrenica, however, is that it made evident the folly of blaming ethnic differences themselves for the crime. There was absolutely nothing inevitable about Srebrenica and the ethnic cleansing that occurred in Bosnia. It was orchestrated by individuals, not history, and was therefore preventable. And had there been the political will to act, while we insist and do on bringing to those responsible, like Ratko Mladic, to justice, we must also acknowledge our own burden of having failed to intervene to stop him and his murderous minions. If we do not learn from this mistake, human rights violations, ethnic conflicts, and possibly even genocide will continue to occur. There are only some of the very good reasons for conducting today's hearing. With that, we're going to turn to our witnesses, and I look forward to a discussion. I can assure our witnesses that your entire statements will be made part of the record of the Commission, and you may proceed as you would like. We'll start off with the Ambassador at the table of the
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, members of the Helsinki Commission, ladies and gentlemen, let me take this opportunity to express my gratitude for having been invited to address this eminent body on a topic which, contrary to many expectations, continues to be of top actuality whenever we talk about security and the current challenges to peace and stability in Europe. I'm honored to have this opportunity today to share with you some considerations and findings which emanate from the report on the conflict in Georgia in August 2008. As you well know, the report, which I will introduce today, has been submitted to the Council of the European Union more than half a year ago. On the same occasion, the report has also been handed over to the parties to the conflict, Georgia and the Russian Federation, to the OSCE and the UN as stipulated in the mission's mandate. The report has also been given to the conflicting parties South Ossetia and Abkhazia. For a number of reasons, not the least to avoid misquotations and misinterpretation, the report has been made publicly available on internet immediately after its release. The report has found wide international attention. The reaction in the press, in public have almost always been positive or factual and neutral. The conflicting parties reacted in the overwhelming majority in a moderate way, although we unfortunately could observe some rather selective reading, each party presenting those parts of the report which were to their liking. Allow me to briefly record the origin and mandate of the report. By its decision of 2 December 2008, the EU Council commissioned an independent international fact-finding mission to investigate the August 2008 conflict in Georgia. The Council appointed me as the head of the fact-finding mission, leaving to me all decisions as to its working methods and proceedings. The mandate's terms of references requested the Commission to investigate the origins and the causes of the conflict of August 2008 in Georgia.
I'm trying to get you a better mic there.
So the mandate was a threefold mandate: investigate the causes, the origins and the causes, and the course of the August 2008 conflict in Georgia, including with regard to international law, including the Helsinki Final Act, with regard to humanitarian law and human rights, and the accusations made in that context, including allegations of war crimes. The geographical scope and time span was to be sufficiently broad to determine all possible causes of the conflict. A very extensive task for which the mission was assigned a relatively short time frame of just about 9 months. The report contains over 1,000 pages. This seems to be fairly voluminous. However, the main results of the report are summarized on some 25 pages at its very beginning under the heading of the conflict in Georgia in August 2008. This summary includes the main events that occurred and their underlying reasons in terms of their political, historical, military and legal relevance, and the latter both in the context of international law and international humanitarian law, as well as human rights law. They include the most substantial elements, facts and findings of the report, followed by a dozen of the most important observations, sort of lessons learned, which have emerged in the course of the work. Preceding this summary, there is also a short introduction explaining the context, the methods and the purpose of the mission's work. The summary is followed by an acknowledgement of the efforts of all those who contributed to the mission's work. These chapters, together with a few additional pages of a more technical content, such as maps and a list of the mission's visit and meetings, represent most of volume 1 of the report, then followed by 2 additional volumes 2 and 3. Volume 2 includes about 450 pages of expert opinions and analysis, which were among the most important but not the only foundations for the report's facts and conclusions. These 450 pages contain all the relevant information which in one way or another has to do with the conflicts in Georgia. Volume 3, with around 650 pages, contains mainly the unabridged and unaltered statements and answers to the mission's question, as received from the different sides to the conflict and other sources. Hence, the total report comprises around 1,150 pages, divided into 3 volumes as just explained. Let me point out some further elements related to the mission's work and its report. First among these is the political context. It needs to be recalled that the European Union played an important role in stopping the fighting in Georgia in August 2008 and in negotiating the agreements necessary for a ceasefire. This was largely due to the persistent efforts of the then French EU presidency led by President Sarkozy. Even now, the European Union continues to be actively engaged in stabilizing efforts such as the EU monitoring mission and in the Geneva talks. We understand that our mission was also part of this overall European Union policy which aims at securing a peaceful and lasting solution to the conflicts in Georgia. Another important point, I would like to stress that our fact-finding mission was the first fact-finding mission of its kind in the history of the European Union. Our aim was to prepare a fair and non-partisan presentation of the events and an equally balanced evaluation in terms of international and humanitarian law. Our hope was that the report will make a valid contribution to a negotiated solution of the conflict. Yet, it is not enough to approach this conflict in terms of its political, legal and military aspects. It is even more so a matter of minds. Those who were involved in the conflict were usually focusing only on their own truths. They were hardly ever sufficiently prepared to look at the truth of the others. It must be understood, however, that no solution to the conflict is possible unless it comes from the principles themselves and unless it reflects not only their own perceptions, but those of the other sides as well. The report wishes to encourage this process of reorientation. In this context, it needs to be underlined that the fact-finding mission was not leading an investigation relevant to judicial proceedings of any sort. It was a strictly fact-finding mission. In keeping with the mandate conferred by the EU Council, this report should not be seen as a tribunal, and it was not preparing any legal action in favor or against any side or anyone. The mission's task was to establish, to the best of its knowledge, facts and their relevance under international and humanitarian law. There is hardly any chance for a future peace without the facts being presented in a sober and impartial manner. This was the main purpose of the report. Indeed, an objective, unbiased and non-partisan approach has been one of the most basic and most important guidelines of the mission's work. The impact of the mission's report and with it the contribution it can make towards peace and stability largely depend on its acceptance by the sides to the conflict, and this again is contingent upon the report's fairness. This is what the mission has tried to achieve. If there is any basic message of the report, apart from drawing attention to the human dimension of the conflict and all the tragedy of the events, then it is in the form of a renewed call upon all conflicting sides to comply with the basic rules of international law, such as the respect of sovereignty and territorial integrity, and the non-use of force or the threat of force, as these principles are enshrined in the Charter of the United Nations. At the same level, there is a similar need for uncompromising observance of the guidelines for international interaction and behavior, which is linked in a European context to the OSCE and its landmark documents, beginning with the Helsinki Final Act of 1975 through to the Charter for the European Security, as well as all the relevant documents of the Council of Europe and, of course, the UN Charter. All these have suffered as a result of the August 2008 fighting in Georgia, and all sides to the conflict must do their utmost to give these political and legal instruments their rightful places of decisiveness in international relations again. At the same time, it derives from these observations that this conflict has not only a local or regional relevance, but that it has a direct bearing on the security architecture of Europe. While fairness, a non-partisan and even-handed approach are the pivots of the mission's working methods, a similar effort has been made to provide clear-cut answers when it comes to the results of the mission's work. Let me start with the answer to the question which in the past has been asked most frequently. In the mission's view, it was Georgia which triggered off the war when it attacked Trinidad with heavy artillery on the night of 7 to 8 August 2008. None of the explanations given by the Georgian authorities in order to provide some form of legal justification for the attack lended the right explanation. In particular, to the best of our knowledge, there were no massive Russian military invasion underway, which had to be stopped by Georgian military forces shelling Trinidad. This said, it needs to be stressed that the Georgian attack against Trinidad on 7 to 8 August 2008 was by no means an isolated event. It was but the culminating point of months and years of mounting tension, of armed incidents and a steadily deteriorating situation. All sides of the conflict bear responsibility for these ever more serious developments. Indeed, the conflict has deep roots in the history of the region, in people's national traditions and aspirations, as well as in age-old perceptions, or rather misperception, of each other, which were never mended and sometimes exploited. The report on the conflict in Georgia has shown that any explanation of the origins of the conflict cannot focus solely on the artillery attack on Trinidad in the night of 7 to 8 August, and on what then developed into a Georgian offensive against South Ossetia and the ensuing Russian military response. Such an evaluation needs always to take into account the run-up to the open hostilities during the years before and the mounting tension in the months and weeks immediately preceding the outbreak of hostilities. It must also, as stressed earlier, take into consideration years of provocations, mutual accusations, military and political threats, and acts of violence, both inside and outside the conflict zones. It has to consider, too, the impact of a great power's politics and diplomacy against a small and insubordinate neighbor, together with the small neighbor's penchant for acting in the heat of the moment without careful consideration of the final outcome. Not to mention its fear that it might permanently lose an important part of its territory through what it used to call a creeping annexation. While the onus of having actually triggered off the war lies with the Georgian side, the Russian side too carries the blame for a substantial number of violations of international law. These include, even prior to the armed conflict, the mass conferral of Russian citizenship to a majority of the population living in South Ossetia and Abkhazia. It also includes, in terms of an additional violation of international law, the military action by the Russian armed forces on Georgian territory far beyond the needs of a proportionate defense of Russian peacekeepers in Slim Valley who had come under Georgian attack. In addition, the Russian recognition of both South Ossetia and Abkhazia as independent states must be considered as being not valid in the context of international law and as a violation of Georgia's territorial integrity and sovereignty. As far as the contentious issues under international humanitarian law and human rights law are concerned, it is among the main conclusions of the fact-finding mission that Russian and Ossetian allegations claiming that Georgia was carrying out a genocide against the South Ossetian population are not substantiated. On the other side, there are serious indications that ethnic cleansing did take place in many instances against ethnic Georgians and their villages and settlements in South Ossetia, as well as other violations of international humanitarian law, which must be attributed to all sides. Furthermore, there are serious question marks behind the attitude of the Russian armed forces, who would not or could not stop atrocities committed by armed groups or even individuals fighting on the South Ossetian side against the civilian population in those territories which were controlled by the Russian armed forces. In our report, we noted with regret an erosion of the respect of established principles of international law, such as territorial integrity, and at the same time an increased willingness on all sides to accept the use of force as a means to reach one's political goals and to act unilaterally instead of seeking a negotiated solution, as difficult and cumbersome as such a negotiation process might be. And finally, we have seen the long trail of human suffering and misery in the wake of armed action. As our mission was created as a fact-finding mission and not as a political consultative body, the mission has abstained from laying out a political roadmap on how to handle and possibly to resolve the still ongoing conflict. While describing the events and their causes, the mission has noted, however, a number of elements which contributed to the steady escalation of tension and finally to the armed conflict of August 2008. The mission has tried to identify these elements in the report's chapter on observations, and it has added brief suggestions to each of them. Number one, first and foremost, I would recommend abstaining from assigning an overall responsibility for what has happened in Georgia in 2008. The conflicts in South Ossetia and Abkhazia are rooted in a profusion of causes comprising different layers in time and actions combined. While it is possible to identify the authorship of some important events and decisions marking its course, there is no way to assign an overall responsibility for the conflict to one side alone. All parties to the conflict have failed, and it should be their responsibility to make good for it. Second, in the 2008 conflict in Georgia, preventive diplomacy and international conflict management was not successful, partly because of what I would call a gradual erosion of previously negotiated and agreed common parameters, as well as an increasing disrespect of international commitment. In order to keep peace or even just the effectiveness of a ceasefire agreement, we don't need any new agreements or previous apart from those existing already. Another important point are the existing provisions when it comes to the supply of arms and military equipment, as well as military training in a conflict region. Even when done within the limits established by international law or by commitments of a non-binding nature, such as the relevant OSCE and UN principles or the Wassenaar arrangements, Military support should stay within the limits set by common sense and due diligence. Utmost care should be taken to by providers of military aid to refrain from giving their support, even unintentionally or indirectly, to any actions or developments detrimental to the stability in the region. Another point is the virtually passive and non-innovative approach to the peace processes adopted by the international community present in the area, I mean the OSCE in South Ossetia and the UN in Abkhazia. They did not help to bring about a peaceful settlement of the conflict. When in early spring 2008, the international community eventually realized the seriousness of the situation and deployed intense high-level diplomacy with US State Secretary Condoleezza Rice, EU High Representative Javier Solana, and German Foreign Minister Frank-Walter Steinmeier presenting one diplomatic initiative after the other. It was too late and not enough to prevent the forthcoming crisis. The international context in which the August 2008 events were unfolding was without any doubt complicated by decisions on Kosovo's independence and its international recognition. Together with the Bucharest NATO summit of April 2008, with its promise of Georgia's future NATO membership, these events complicated the international context in which the events were unfolding. The decision by the Russian Federation to withdraw the 1996 CIS restrictions on Abkhazia and to authorize direct relations with the Abkhaz and the South Ossetian sides in a number of fields in spring 2008 added another dimension to an already complex situation in the area. This added to the lack of timely and sufficiently determined action by the international community, and as already mentioned, to some degree, the non-innovative approach to the peace process in Abkhazia and South Ossetia adopted by the international organization contributed to the unfolding of the crisis. There is another important point and a favorite topic of mine, which I have experienced in many years of work in conflict zones. It concerns the arrangements made to end an open conflict. It is my deep belief that any ceasefire agreement, as unsatisfactory as it may be for all sides, is still better than a war or open hostilities. However, it needs also to be said that all ceasefire arrangements sooner or later are worn out or overtaken by events. As in the case of the UN in Abkhazia or the OSCE in South Ossetia, mandates become inadequate or even instrumental in cementing uncompromising positions. What may have been an effective tool for ending the hostilities, in our case the conflict in the early 90s, may turn out to be obsolete 15 years later and even lead directly to open hostilities. Finally, it must be noted that there are no winners in this conflict. Everyone has lost, if not in terms of life and property alone, at least in the fields of hopes and prospects for the future. This is true not only of the relations between Tbilisi on one side and Sukhumi and Srinivali on the other side, where the August 2008 conflict has not settled any of the contentious issues. The situation in the conflict region continues to remain tense. Relations between Georgia and Russia have come to an all-time low, and the international community is among the losers too. The political culture of cooperativeness had developed in Europe since the 1970s on the basis of already mentioned landmark documents of the CEC and the OSCE has suffered. The threat and use of force have now returned to European politics. Established principles of international law, such as the respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity of states, were ignored. Violations of international humanitarian and human rights law, such as ethnic cleansing, have resurfaced as elements of political reality. And last but not least, the relations between the Western powers and Russia have suffered. The international community, as well as other regional and non-regional actors involved in the conflict, should make every conceivable effort not only to bring the sides to the negotiating table, but also to address the urgent political question on how to overcome the gap that was created by the conflict in Georgia in August 2008. The successful outcome of such negotiations should also do much to mend the relations between Western powers and Russia. There is little hope, however, and here I'm quoting the conclusion of our report, there is little hope for a peaceful future in the conflict region unless the two main contenders, Russia and Georgia, make bilateral efforts themselves to solve their disputes. This needs to be done now. It is our sincere hope that the report may contribute to a better understanding and most importantly to a sober assessment of the situation by the conflicting sides, and through this be instrumental to peace and stability in the conflict region and beyond. Thank you for your attention.
Ambassador Tagliavini, first of all, thank you very much for that detailed explanation of the Russian-Georgia issues. I don't think anyone has as much experience on this than you do, so we very much appreciate the personal presentation. Ambassador Semneby.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen. I very much appreciate this opportunity to testify before the US Helsinki Commission on this very timely topic. I would like to start where my colleague Ambassador Tagliavini finished, and that is with the Russian-Georgian war. There was undoubtedly a war between two states, but where the foundations, the deeper foundations, lay in the fraught interethnic relations between Georgians on the one hand and Abkhaz and South Ossetians on the other hand, which was a result of the wars of the 1990s. These interethnic conflicts gradually became hijacked as part of a larger interstate conflict, and I would even say, to some extent, a geostrategic conflict. The European Union, as Ambassador Tagliavini mentioned, responded to this challenge in August of 2008 by brokering the ceasefire between Russia and Georgia, by deploying a monitoring mission, launching talks between the parties, hosting a donors conference, and sponsoring the independent commission of which Ambassador Tagliavini led. The European Union also responded at the more strategic level by launching the so-called Eastern Partnership in the spring of 2009. The purpose of this initiative, which covers not only the three countries in the South Caucasus, but also Belarus, Moldova and Ukraine, is to promote a prosperous and stable neighborhood to be able to better respond to specific concerns and aspirations of the Eastern neighbors through EU approximation, stronger political relationship, free trade, liberalization of travel, and so on, and also as part of this relationship promoting rule of law, human rights, good governance, which includes also minority rights that are the topic of our hearing today. The war demonstrated that the status quo that we had seen emerge in the Caucasus was a dangerous one. Status quo can always delude policymakers outside a region like this, especially if it's a faraway region, to conclude that all is fine and then attention can be paid elsewhere. If anything, though, if there was any lesson of the Russia-Georgia war, though, it was that frozen does not mean safe. I will also mention another factor here, and that is the closed borders of the South Caucasus that we have seen as a consequence of this status quo. There are obviously consequences of the conflicts, but they are increasingly also becoming sources of conflict, as many of them have now been closed for more than a decade. People on each side of these borders are at best growing up in ignorance about each other. but at worst with reinforced enemy images. The new generation on each side of these borders, or administrative boundaries as they may sometimes be as well, will not only be divided by ethnicity, but also by lack of knowledge about each other, and often not even sharing a common language anymore. I believe that the European Union and other partners of the countries in the region have a huge role to play in contributing to a culture of dialogue in the region, promoting regional cooperation and development opportunities across these borders and boundaries. Let me mention a few words on each one of the conflicts that we are facing in the region. I will start briefly with the Turkey-Armenia conflict. The EU as well as the United States have focused a great, and Switzerland as well. In particular Switzerland I would mention as the mediator in this long-standing conflict. We have focused a good deal of political and diplomatic attention on the rapprochement between Turkey and Armenia. This is a conflict that has a long and difficult history. It is obviously much more than an interstate conflict. It has strong historical roots going back to the very tragic history of the late Ottoman Empire. As I said, it is more than an interstate conflict, but it also doesn't fall in the classical kin-state pattern. But as anybody here in Congress is aware, it very much involves the large Armenian diaspora residing both in the United States and in the European Union and elsewhere. We find ourselves now at a critical moment in the efforts to normalize relations between the two states and open the common border. The protocols that were signed in October 2009 have been submitted to the Turkish and Armenian parliaments but have yet to be ratified. Both sides, given the charged background, history, apprehensions, will have to take courageous steps, which will be indeed controversial among parts of their respective constituencies in order to move towards the ratification and the implementation of the protocols. From the beginning here, the reaction of Azerbaijan was predictably negative, with many in Azerbaijan regarding this even as a step of betrayal by their brethren and ethnic kin in Turkey. The EU has made it clear that this process is not, we believe this process is not against the interests of Azerbaijan, and that ultimately the stability of the region with the region with open borders will be to the benefit of all, including Azerbaijan. It's important, together with our partners, including the United States, that we continue to work with Azerbaijan to reassure the leadership of our continued commitment to Azerbaijan, to dialogue with Azerbaijan, and our commitment to Azerbaijan as a strategically important partner. On a positive note on the protocols, I would say that even in this difficult situation we're facing now, they may already have contributed positively to improved relations between Turks and Armenians. Although the border does remain closed, we have observed a dismantling of what I would call mental barriers, including an increasing number of visits in both directions by civil society representatives, journalists, together with an intensified exchange of ideas and opinions, something that makes me cautiously positive as to the future. On Nagorno-Karabakh, this conflict is perhaps the most fraught in terms of inter-ethnic antagonism in the region. The war in the early 1990s was an exceptionally bloody one that left deep and painful wounds with many dead and hundreds of thousands driven from their homes. This conflict is also a classical example of the difficulty of reconciling principles of the Helsinki Final Act with each other, in particular territorial integrity with the right of self-determination. The EU does not have a direct role in the peace talks under the OSCE Minsk Group, but the increasing engagement of the European Union bilaterally with the countries in the region and collectively also with the EU's eastern partners suggests that the EU could indeed play a larger and more assertive role. I believe that we can make important practical and political contributions in support of the resolution of the conflict and in support of the efforts of the Minsk Group. There's a particular need here to work with the populations of the two countries, and this includes also Nagorno-Karabakh. There is a disconnect today between the highest levels, those conducting the negotiations, and the wider populations, which are still very much entrenched in their positions, relying on old stereotypes of the enemy. Without a shift in perspectives in these societies, it will be very difficult for the respective leaders to sell an eventual peace to their respective electorates. And the more time passes, the more difficult this will become. As to the Georgia conflict, this needs to be analyzed, as I mentioned, at two levels: the interstate conflict between Georgia and Russia, and the interethnic and intercommunal conflict between the Georgians and the Abkhaz. I will not go into any detail here. I believe you have received as good a presentation as one can get from Ambassador Tagliavini, but I would just like to recall that Russia's recognition of Abkhazia and South Ossetia as independent states, and the continued presence of significant Russian forces in Abkhazia and South Ossetia in areas where Russian such forces were not present to August of 2008 and would remain there in violation of the six-point ceasefire agreement. That all of this means that the prospect of normalization in the near and medium term between Russia and Georgia is unlikely. I would also recall that the recognition by Russia of the independence of Abkhazia and South Ossetia followed upon a long history of increasing tensions, as has been described, including the controversial granting of citizenship to the populations of these, Russian citizenship to the populations of these regions. There have, at the same time, been some positive steps between Russia and Georgia, notably the opening of a border crossing point in March of this year. This is now the only legal crossing point between the two countries, since other roads and the now defunct rail link all run through either Abkhazia or South Ossetia. The opening of this border could have positive implications not only for the Russian-Georgian relationship, but also regionally beyond Georgia's borders, notably for Armenia. As for the intercommunity conflict, this conflict naturally was in the background, has been in the background since the Russian-Georgian war. But it needs to be recalled that from the point of view of the population of the breakaway regions, there are serious concerns regarding, in particular, security in the broadest sense, including for language and culture. From the point of view of the Georgian side, the main issue is the right of return of the displaced Georgian population, and in particular after the war, also the rights of the remaining Georgian population in the conflict regions, including their freedom of movement across the administrative boundary lines. At the end of last year, the European Union adopted a policy vis-à-vis Georgia's breakaway regions based on two principles of non-recognition and engagement. And indeed, we consider these two principles to be indispensable parts of one integral policy. Why it's imperative to remain unequivocally committed to the issue of principle, the respect for Georgia's territorial integrity, It's also essential to be flexible and pragmatic in practice, for example, by promoting contacts with the population of the breakaway regions. It's only through engagement and establishing a footprint in the breakaway regions that the European Union can provide an alternative perspective for Abkhazia and could provide a perspective for the populations in Abkhazia and South Ossetia that is similar to the vision shared by the Georgians, and how the European Union in this way also can ensure that its soft power can function. All of this also requires that Georgia reaches out, and we are working closely with the Georgian government in order to encourage such an approach, including through support for the state strategy, the implementation of a state strategy that was adopted to this effect some time ago. I spent 3 years, more than 3 years, also in the Balkans, as you mentioned, Mr. Chairman, in the beginning. And in conclusion, this leads me to make some reflections on parallels between the South Caucasus and the Balkans. The conflicts in these two areas were both caused by the collapse of multi-ethnic superstates with the dominating metropolis. Both the Soviet Union and the old Yugoslavia acknowledged and even supported ethnic identities as a kind of safety valve, but at the same time they tried to keep the ethnic groups in check by carefully balancing their interests and suppressing any expression of ethnic interests that threatened the legitimacy of the superstate. In both cases, there were also attempts to artificially develop a common non-ethnic and fairly ideological identity on the top of and as an eventual alternative to the ethnic identities, that is the Soviet and Yugoslav identities. These strategies ultimately imploded, and both in the Soviet Union and in the former Yugoslavia, the inter-ethnic conflicts were then hijacked as part of interstate conflicts between the countries that emerged, conflicts that were more about dividing up resources, revising maps, and projecting power than anything else. Most of the conflicts in the Balkans were put to rest fairly rapidly because this region was located in the heart of Europe and was a subject of intensive attention from the European Union, NATO, United States, and others. The European accession agenda that was launched at the European Union Summit in Thessaloniki in 2003 gave the countries in this region a vision to strive for, while it also underlined the attention of the European Union and its member states to these regions and its problems, including the inter-ethnic conflicts. It paved the way for the re-establishment of economic relations and trade, cooperation on war crimes, and symbolic acts of reconciliation. The countries of the South Caucasus do not have a membership perspective, but it's also important to notice that the Eastern Partnership does not exclude the possibility of a membership perspective at some time in the future. I have focused this presentation on conflict management, but both regions contain further conflict potential, which makes prevention an indispensable priority alongside the handling of the existing protracted conflicts. There are many potential hotspots in the South Caucasus, in particular, that I'm dealing with at the moment: the Azeri and Armenian minorities in Georgia, where unemployment and social problems could acquire an ethnic conflict dimension if not handled correctly. Some areas of Azerbaijan, where religious revival, both Sunni and Shiite, is creating concerns. The danger of spillover from the increasingly precarious situation in the economically depressed and ethnically diverse Russian North Caucasus. Many European Union programs are geared towards regional development and in depressed minority areas, and we're also working on legislation, institution building, education and other rights issues, together with the OSCE, including the High Commissioner on National Minorities and the Council of Europe. So in the longer run, how can we overcome these interethnic divisions and avoid that they become instruments again in larger conflicts? I would highlight two concepts here: shared identity and common interests. Ethnicity is very much about identity, and one of the visions closest at hand would therefore be to try to adjust the identities that have pitched people in these two regions against each other. As the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia waned, the superficial Soviet and Yugoslav identities rapidly disappeared, but only to be replaced by narrow and exclusive national, and I would even say nationalist identities in the successor states. Only the gradually increasing role of the European Union, only with the gradually increasing role of the European Union has the prospect of a new larger identity emerge that could ultimately contribute to a common purpose and become a complement to the national identities, softening them, adding a layer to them but without replacing them. We've already seen this in the Balkans, and I'm confident that this transformation will also take place ultimately in the South Caucasus, as long as the European Union has the will to deliver relevant benefits to the countries and engage with the conflict regions. The other concept here would be to nurture common interests between the countries and areas populated by different ethnicities. This requires first and foremost open borders, not least since both the Balkans and the South Caucasus are located right on strategic communications routes for goods, energy and peoples. All the South Caucasus conflicts, in fact, Abkhazia, South Ossetia and Nagorno-Karabakh, are almost literally roadblocks sitting on and preventing traffic on important strategic communications routes. With a renewed paradigm for the South Caucasus, and I would say this paradigm would be a region of intersecting strategic communications routes, it may be possible for the states in the region to focus on the benefits of cooperation as an alternative to the continuing practice of instrumentalizing differences among them interethnic and holding these hostages to wider conflicts. This paradigm will be similar to the rationale behind the functional integration that led to the decision 50 years ago to pool Europe's strategic resources to prevent further conflicts. A momentous decision that soon led to the emergence of the European communities and later to the European Union. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. I particularly appreciated your observations on prevention. Once the conflicts become frozen or active, it's very difficult to deal with the displacements and all the problems that come with it. So thank you very much for that. We'll now turn to Mr. Jensen Peterson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you very much for convening this meeting. This is my third opportunity to appear before this commission. I did it in 1996 when I was a special envoy of the UN High Commission for Refugees in what was then called the former Yugoslavia. Then again in 2005 when I was the special representative of the UN Secretary General and Administrator of Kosovo. And now I'm delighted to be back. I know the role that this commission has been playing, is playing in its constant focus on not the least the human dimensions of conflicts, which over the last 7-8 years we have tended very often to ignore or forget in our pursuit of what we call state security. There were 7 conflicts in the Western Balkans from 1991 to 2001. They had as their objective the forcible displacement of other groups, be they political, ethnic, social, religious, or community, or what we also call the ethnic cleansing of other groups. When the first of these conflicts erupted in 1991, there was the by now infamous statement by the Luxembourg Foreign Minister, then chair of the EU, that the hour of Europe is now. We know today that that hour never came. We know that unfortunately Europe failed to prevent and stop the conflicts. That was done thanks to an initial hesitant involvement on the part of the United States and then NATO leadership also. And the role of the EU during the conflict was mainly relegated to humanitarian assistance, which at the time as a senior official in UNHCR, I of course appreciated, although as many were concerned that the humanitarian efforts during the war became a substitute for decisive political action. Now in the post-conflict rebuilding, Europe has, as it should indeed, taken the lead and working very closely with the not only European Union, European Commission, but with the OSCE and the UN have played prominent roles in reverting the goals of what those 7 conflicts were all about. That means focusing on rebuilding the physical and human scars of the destruction during the war, working on reversing the displacement by helping refugees displaced to return or to relocate elsewhere, and then certainly working on trying to heal the divisions through coexistence, reconciliation and judicial measures. We have come a long way over the last 10 years. I have always been convinced that the best way to address inter-ethnic tensions in that region have been by addressing the past through a forward-looking strategy, by locking all the countries of the Western Balkan into a future larger Europe. As Ambassador Senderby just mentioned, that policy was confirmed at the summit of the European Union in Thessaloniki, Greece in June 2003, when the EU confirmed the European perspective of countries of the Western Balkans. That means in normal language confirming that they will all one day be members of the European Union. Since then, Slovenia moved in, as we know, in 2004. Croatia is now in the final stages of its accession process. Macedonia has embarked on that process, but is being delayed by the continued dispute with Greece over the name issue. And the other countries in the region, Albania, Bosnia, Kosovo, Montenegro and Serbia, are in various stages, rather early stages, of the accession process. But there must be no doubt, there is no doubt, that they will all one day be members of the European Union. There are 3 major outstanding issues in the way of progress. The first is the continued constitutional mess in Bosnia and Herzegovina that hampers progress and still leaves worrying questions of whether the forces of integration or the forces of separation in that country will prevail. The second outstanding issue is Serbia's continued objections to the independence of Kosovo, an independence which is a reality recognized now by 67 of the UN member states, but still not recognized by 5 member states of the European Union. Serbia, of course, has a right to object to the independence of Kosovo, but in my view, the European Union should not move forward with Serbia's progress into the European Union as long as there is this unresolved bilateral issue between Serbia and Kosovo, because that would risk EU unity, Western Balkan states cooperation, and as we have seen already, having made the mistake in the past, inviting in countries involved in bilateral conflicts, for example, Cyprus, or the name of the issue over Macedonia, and until recently also a bilateral issue between Slovenia and Croatia. These are all detrimental to the main focus on integrating the countries of Europe into EU, and it delays the accession process. So EU, I hope, would not make that mistake again. Thirdly, the third last, I believe, major outstanding issue is based on a very positive development. Over the last couple of years, EU has finally moved to liberalize visa procedures, allowing citizens from the countries of the Western Balkans to travel freely also into and around in Europe. That is important because they need to see and learn and take back exactly what an EU perspective means. So it's a very welcome development. Unfortunately, the citizens of Bosnia and Kosovo are still not benefiting from the visa liberalization. Those two countries are not considered ready. One could say that is quite strange in view of the fact that we have a very heavy European Union involvement exactly in those two countries. And it is a pity because leaving two countries behind in the very welcome liberalization of the visas do to a certain extent defeat the purpose, because if there are gaps in the areas of the freedom of movement, we will still fail in bringing states of the region together and also together with the EU. And I hope that the leaving out of Bosnia and Kosovo will be rectified in the very early future. Let me just then sum up by addressing the need to mitigate those ethnic tensions that still remain. But I want to underline, I think we have come a considerable way in addressing those tensions. And also, I would like to agree with you, Mr. Chairman, in your opening remarks, that those ethnic tensions have mostly been those fed by the political leadership and not really cultivated by the citizens of the region. The first point that we need to continue paying very important attention to is the need for accountability for the crimes committed during the war. We have to continue doing it through the International Criminal Tribunal on former Yugoslavia and through local judicial institutions. We know that a lot of work has been done very good, unfortunately, on three of the principal actors responsible for the crimes. We never got to the sentencing of President Milosevic. Ratko Mladic, as you said, Mr. Chairman, is still at large, and the process of Mr. Cardin is just underway. I think to complete that process, to send a clear message, it is very important that the work continues. Secondly, in order to address still remaining inter-ethnic tensions, we need to focus much more on economic opportunities and jobs on the ground. We need to do that to move the people from an understandable focus that they still have on the past, and as Ambassador Semneby mentioned, to bring them together around common economic interest, not just shared identity, but shared common interests in building the future. Too little attention has been paid to the importance of economic development in inter-ethnic reconciliation and coexistence. The third point is we need to continue promoting and consolidating all the key aspects of a modern democracy. That is the good governance, the rule of law, freedom of expression, freedom of media, continuing combating organized crime and corruption, respect for minorities, respect for human rights. These are all, or mostly all, the things that OSCE has been focusing on from the period during the conflicts, and I personally worked very closely with OSCE in both in Bosnia and as administrator of Kosovo, and seen the work on the ground. This is why the role of the OSCE in mitigating and addressing these still remaining tensions are absolutely crucial, not only in consolidating the still fragile peace in certain areas, but turning that fragile peace into sustainable peace and prosperity in the region. I believe we are moving in the right direction. There are still a few concerns there, but if we continue maintaining our focus on our attention on the region, working and locking all these formerly conflicting states into the Euro, I believe that we may not have to meet on this again 5 years from now, and I may not need to be invited back, although once again I enjoy being here. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Well, thank you. I can assure you we will invite you back to celebrate all the problems being solved. So you'll get an invitation in either case. We hope it's one to report progress. Let me tell you just how I think helpful all of your testimonies have been to the work of our commission and to the work of OSCE. I must tell you, I don't see a conflict between principle 4 dealing with territorial integrity and principle that deals with self-determination. To me, they're very compatible. And I think the point made about the shared purpose, the shared identity, is critically important. Georgia territorial integrity should be maintained, but it's the responsibility of government leaders to instill a shared identity and pride in the country. I would add another point to that. To me, there's also a responsibility to protect the human rights and the ability to protect your ethnic identity within the state. And that has not been as strong as it needs to be. We saw that not just in what happened between Russia and Georgia, but also in Bosnia, and continues to this day. I mean, there's a real risk in Bosnia as to whether the state will succeed in its integration into Europe. And to me, the key is going to be whether there is this pride and a shared identity and a shared purpose, understanding the ethnic differences of the population, which is, to me, part of the richness of Bosnia, part of the richness of the United States. So I think these are struggles that we're going to have to continue to figure out how to deal with. I want to talk about, I guess, one political side to OSCE and then one substantive question on a policy that seems to be moving forward. Russia is obviously a critical player in many of these issues. Russia has been pretty open about its concern that OSCE seems to concentrate more on the Eastern Europe, east of Vienna, on the countries of the former Soviet Union, than it does on the other member states of OSCE. That's certainly been its concern on election monitoring, on human rights issues. But yet most of the ethnic conflicts are taking place in countries of the former Soviet Union. So it would seem to me that Russia, which has a lot of minorities in these populations, has to be very interested in this issue. Does this present an opportunity, using the OSCE framework, to get Russia more engaged in dealing with the protection of minorities, or not? Or do they just see it as a conflict with Georgia and therefore can't get beyond that? That's the political question. I'll get this on the substantive ones. Who wants to take a shot at that? The politics of Russia. You volunteered. Ambassador Senator.
I thank you very much. Well, as I mentioned in my testimony, unfortunately the ethnic conflicts have been hijacked as part of other conflicts, including interstate conflicts, and I think we need to address the conflicts at all levels at the same time. I think it's only natural, and I hope that this is a message also that will be that is understood in Moscow, that given the fact that we have had a momentous change happening in the former Soviet Union as the republics of the Soviet Union became independent, a momentous change that changed also the relationships between ethnic majority, ethnic minority. Many former minorities became majorities, and vice versa. And it's only natural that it is in this area, as you say, that we have most of the ethnic issues, ethnic conflicts taking place because of the need to redefine relationships. Indeed, Russia has many issues of this kind also in its own territory, and some of which I believe that Russia itself is very concerned about. I mentioned the North Caucasus, which is the case in point here, and we have seen some measures taken from Moscow that indicates a greater degree of awareness of the challenges, of the issues that Russia is facing in this area, with obvious also spillover effects and mutual influences between the North and the South. And I do really believe that there could be considerable opportunities here to work.
It'll be a challenge, but I think it is, we're looking for ways of getting a more effective participation of Russia within the OSCE. We thought the Corfu process, which came about at their request, would be an avenue to move forward, but to date it's still, the jury's out as to whether that process will be effective. I guess a related question is whether the Corfu process can work in regards to mitigating the ethnic conflicts in regions using this type of effort. Any thought as to Russia? What the best strategy is? Madam Ambassador?
Well, it's very difficult to compare this Corfu process, which is a sort of a new approach, which has been actually convened rather by an initiative by one of the presidents of these OSCE member states. I think the minority conflicts and ethnic tensions in the region, in the southern Caucasus, but also in the northern Caucasus, lay well beyond that layer. The difficulty to tackle them is really this combination of factors that need to be taken into account. These wrong perceptions of history, this methodology or mythology of my own history, and it's incompatible with all the proposals that can be made from outside. And that, of course, embedded in, first of all, in the country, and then in an OSCE or in any structure, makes it extremely difficult to get even cooperation from those who should cooperate, and that would be the conflicting parties. We see these many layers of obstacles, and so I don't think that a process will be able to tackle these things. Rather, I would turn it around, that I believe there is some homework to be done on the ground, and there I think the EU engagement, non-recognition, but engagement at the civil society level, at any level that may not cut off these minorities from the political course of the developments is very important. As we have seen, there is a combination, it's almost a fatal combination of simply lack of willingness to come to a solution which is not in line with what one ethnic group, ethnic minority wishes for itself, and where it has become totally fixed in an idea that this is independence and nothing less than independence. And that was, I think, one of the weak points of all the peace processes, peace initiatives, negotiation processes, that the parties that were negotiating did not really look at the possibility of a solution, but only at the aim of the fulfilling of their request, be it independence, be it sovereignty, be it a request for a particular territory. And what was complicating this request was looking for outside support. That was true for the Abkhaz and the South Ossetians, looking for Russian support for their strive for secession and for their strive for independence, and getting the support. The same goes with Georgia. Tbilisi, the official Tbilisi, also hoped that the outside world, not the least NATO, Western Europe, and the United States would be in support. There we get into this very, very complicated, complex game where you don't really distinguish where is actually the platform on which you can operate. It's always mixed.
Well, thank you for that. Mr. Jensen Peters, I'd like to ask you a question. I think your point about the ability to transition into Europe, admission into the EU, perhaps NATO, is the carrot that gives us the opportunity to really bring about change. You mentioned it in regards to Serbia. I could mention it also in regards to Bosnia, not just the constitutional reform that's needed in that country, but the political leadership that's needed in that country to really represent a functioning state. It's certainly going to be critically important, I know, in the NATO discussions that you have a state that there's confidence in that can speak for the integrity of the entire geographical area. I want to talk about a development. If a country becomes a member of the EU, of course, it gives them certain rights within all the EU states. There seems to be a trend, though, in many of these developing countries to grant citizenship to ethnic communities outside of their territorial state. And I'm curious whether you know how that is. Is that a growing trend? Is Russia doing that as far as ethnic minorities in other parts of Eastern Europe? And does that present an issue that perhaps could complicate full integration into Europe for some of the former states of the Soviet Union or the former Yugoslavia?
I'm not aware that it applies to any of the states in the former Yugoslavia. And as to the former Soviet Union, I will sort of think Ambassador Tagliavini is in a better position.
Ambassador?
I think this is indeed a very worrisome tendency, and I'm very glad that in our report we have a very detailed description of this practice of conferring citizenship to people living in another country after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, being considered similar citizens of the Soviet Union, but the Soviet Union did not exist anymore. A similar example may be Crimea, and I don't have any figures about the situation in Crimea, but my guess is that the case of what we call the passportization issue in Georgia and the disastrous effects that it had has probably put a brake on this practice. We don't hear many more such distributions in Crimea nor in Transnistria. Another worrying tendency for the European Union is, of course, the massive distribution of Romanian passports to citizens of Moldova and Ukraine. And this goes exactly in this direction, and I think this is also a challenge for the European Union on how to handle such disrespect of international law. We have clearly said in the case of Georgia that the massive conferral of Russian citizenship to citizens in another country was a violation of the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Georgia. So this applies also to countries that are by now members of the European Union. I believe it is a very dangerous tendency, and it has the potential of creating many more conflicts on that kind of basis, creating liabilities to partners that actually do not want to be liable. Who wants to go to war in Moldova on Romanian passport to fight for Romanian citizens? It's certainly not the European Union's aim to be engaged in such a situation. So these are dangerous trends, and I believe utmost care should be taken to prevent such a...
It's an interesting development, and there are reasons for this to be done by countries, but it can cause the additional burdens or additional obstacles that you had mentioned towards ethnic harmony. I want to bring you in on this, Jensen Peterson, but also I want to just make an observation. I was in Montenegro last year. I was also in Bosnia and Croatia. And there's a great deal of interest in Croatia and Montenegro for Bosnia to work out its problems, because every time problems develop, there's more people who flee and go into Croatia and Montenegro. And we talk about, I like the way you put it, the forced displacement. I think you're absolutely right. That's part of the ethnic conflict, is to cleanse. And yes, it may be through murder, but more likely it's going to be through displacement, which not only is a tragic human result in and of itself, but then causes another country, another state to have a burden that can lead to other types of human rights problems and instability in a country. And Montenegro is a very young country, very small country. A few thousand people coming in from Bosnia can have a major impact on its economy, can have a major impact on its political system. So it's a major concern towards their integration and development. So I think the whole dimension here needs to be understood, because prevention is clearly our chief objective. So I guess my question to you, and you can certainly respond more to the last question if you like, is are we seeing an impact among Montenegro and the other countries in the region as a result of Bosnia being still unsettled?
Well, I certainly think we are seeing an impact because the very fact that, as I mentioned in my remarks, because of the constitutional situation, I call it a constitutional mess in Bosnia, I think that there are still very worrying signs that what I call the forces of separation in Bosnia may prevail. And that is a risk that is very often reinforced by irresponsible statements from some of the neighboring states. It has certainly also been linked to the independence of Kosovo, in that that has been used by both politicians inside Bosnia, or Republika Srpska, but also in some of the neighboring states, to sort of issue threats that they could go in the same direction. We know that during the war, or wars rather, in the region, but also in the situation right after, and also during and after the very brief war in Macedonia, which was the seventh and last war. But finally, there we have finally learned our lessons, and the EU, NATO, US intervened immediately to stop it, and the war lasted some 30 days. But both during the other conflicts and the war, in particular in Macedonia and after, there was a lot of talk about Greater Serbia and Greater Albania. That, I think, is another reason why it's so important to lock these countries into a larger European Union. Because the moment that they are part of a larger community of states of interest, then, in my view, all this talk about Greater Albania, it doesn't really matter whether you are Macedonian Albanian, whether you are Kosovo Albanian, or an Albanian in Albania. The moment that you are part of a larger community, the borders come down and you move. That's the whole idea. You move freely around. So, and the same, we have Serb populations, certainly a fairly large one in Bosnia, as you know, in Montenegro, I mean, the Serb descent in Kosovo, a very important minority and all that. Again, bring them into a larger community would, in my view, do away with this focus on bringing various groups together in a larger, be it Serbia, Albania, whatever. And if you speak to the people, because all this, as I said, is fed by irresponsible political leadership. But if you speak, as I know you have been doing, Mr. Chairman, your travel to citizens on the ground, what they want is, as they could do when Yugoslavia existed, travel around freely, get together again with people now in another country and in the larger Europe. That's what they want to do, and that's why it's so important that not only this European perspective is confirmed, but that Europe move forward on it. It's obvious that states need to be ready. There are, of course, many requirements to be met, but sometimes I would wish that one could maybe jump over a few of the obstacles, because the only safe way to address the risks in Bosnia, in my view, is to lock Bosnia into a larger European community. So a little bit risky, courageous policy making, but at the same time I recognize that there are conditions to be met, there are requirements. But after all, that's how the European community started, with the European coal and steel community. That was to lock two countries that have been conflicting and in war many times over the last 100, 200 years, lock them into a larger community. We need that for Western Balkans. That's what the people want. You speak to citizens of Serbia, in particular the young population, they are frankly not that interested in Kosovo. The political leadership of Serbia certainly is. They want to be European citizens. So I believe that is the best response to these concerns, and the concerns do exist.
Well, we strongly support that. We want to see Serbia part of the EU. We want to see Bosnia part of the EU. We want to see Kosovo recognized and its geographical territory respected. Our delegation met with students in Bosnia from all ethnic communities, and you would not have known what ethnic community they were from. I mean, they have pride, and it takes political leadership. And yes, they need constitutional reform, as I've said before. It's critical, I mean, considering the way that it's currently organized, to have a functioning state. But they need political leadership, and that's something that I think people are going to demand, and ultimately will be there, and we will see the full integration. To me, having a state that reflects what you're suggesting, that common identity, but still respects the individualities of the ethnic communities and the right to protect their identity is critical for mitigating the ethnic conflicts, in not only the OSCE region, but in the world. And that's what we're going to work for, and that's what we're going to continue to do. This hearing has been extremely helpful in us filling in a lot of the blanks, particularly an update on what's happening in Georgia and what's happening in Bosnia. We very much appreciate that. I hope we're getting reliable information in Georgia. Without the mission being there, we are concerned that we may not be getting the type of objective information on the condition of the population. And to the extent that we can't get reliable information, feel free to continue to supply us with that. It's helpful to our commission. Congressman Hastings, the co-chair of the commission, has asked that his statement be made part of the record, and Congressman Smith, the ranking Republican member, has also asked for that, and that those requests will be granted. And with that, the hearing will stand adjourned. Thank you all very much.